Thank you, Sri Rahul Srivastava, for discussing about how do we create inclusive spaces, and also for cautioning us about institutional structure with hierarchies, which will not be a successful framework if we need to build a future that is inclusive for everyone. And now over to the hero of IIA Kerala, architect Lata Raman, who heads the Inspiration. She's heading the Inspirations Project Management and Contracts Wing and is responsible for the overall design, interpretation, project management, and technical coordination of all the projects undertaken by her firm. She has long been involved with trying to promote the conversation of gendering of architecture in our practice and design, and is one of the trustees of Psyche Kerala, which is a non-governmental, non-profit organization which aims at bringing everyone to see the world through a gender lens. Over to you, Lata ma'am. Kindly share your experiences and observations so that we can build a way forward.
Thank you so much, Binu, for that introduction. Thank you so much, Mono, for giving me this opportunity to be part of this really amazing, fascinating webinar. It's all the three talks that I've been hearing to are like, they were so inspiring, and I feel a little intimidated actually, but let me share with you my experience as an architect, practicing a woman architect, finding my way of finding my own identity. So I'll share my screen and I hope it's visible, isn't it? Binu, is it clear?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So probably the early understanding of gender perceptions probably began the day that I was born. I was actually born as a fifth daughter to a middle class South Indian family with just 5 daughters. So I grew up early in my life of how my mother was practically kind of shocked when she realized the fifth one was also a girl, and was at times even surprised, like, did I really survive all this kind of? And then growing up amidst often kind of snide remarks from extended families and family friends to my parents, who chose to kind of give us, the 5 of us, the best of education and independence, as why do you want to really get all these girls educated and give them, and then get them married and all that. But somehow there was this quiet power that my parents wielded, that despite all these challenges, we kind of grew up as a very close-knit family. All of us were given enormous freedom to kind of pursue whatever we want to study, whatever we wanted to do. So it is pretty much, though after the initial shock, perhaps, there was pretty much a very comfortable, very well cared, loving family that I grew up with, perhaps cocooned within the warmth and love. And but always there was this kind of an urge to excel, kind of urge to kind of make oneself worthy of being there, as to why should there be this kind of a scare that all 5 of us were daughters, like, kind of. So then moving on, probably with a fairly good academics and all, the joint architecture, and then you get into this very supposedly elite professional study, and go through learning about all the masters of architecture, as Madhvi ji was saying. And somewhere, I think there was also this a lack of clarity of what exactly does studying all this relate to going back into the society where we are, and all that. And of course, I studied in the Department of Architecture in Trivandrum, not necessarily a very one of the premier institutes or anything like that. But one privilege that we who studied in Trivandrum had at that time was actually getting to know and interact with this amazing person called Laurie Baker, the legendary architect. And somewhere, I think Laurie Baker's architecture style uh, stood a stark contrast to the architecture that we kind of learn and sketched and all that, which is more kind of efficiency driven, iconic in that sense. And here we were, around us in Trivandrum, there were this absolutely fascinating buildings which spoke so much about sensitivity. And perhaps that was my first exposure to, knowingly or unknowingly, kind of understanding a non-dominant gendering in design. I'm sure if Baker was around now, he would have heard this, he would have rolled laughing, because he's a person who never kind of believed in any kind of this jargons and saying like that. But somehow I felt that this is what I should be saying. So Baker's architecture for me and probably several of us was inspiring in the sense that it was a sensitivity that actually, there was something very feminine about his approach to architecture, be it the sensitivity to the terrain, the sensitivity to the climate, the sensitivity to each of the clients who he has designed, the kind of the playfulness and the kind of nurturing quality of spaces. I think that kind of, and knowingly or unknowingly, I think there is also this whole symbolism of the yin and yang in many of the works that you could see. So somewhere this was a very strong influence as we moved on with architecture. So naturally, when I finished my course and wanted to practice, I wanted to choose a firm where I could explore this whole concept a little further. And I joined this firm called ESDC, which is based out of Cochin, which is actually initiated by Jay Gopal, who later on became my partner in work and life. And there was this group of us young, it was predominantly a male boys club, I should say. Most of them males, most of us coming from the same college, architects, civil engineers. Some were touched by Laurie Baker's works and the stark contrast, and wanting to kind of explore what it would mean in kind of translating it in our own languages. So it was an intense 3-4 years of work, I think, from 90 onwards, where I was actually thrown into really starting working at site. So there was a whole lot of acceptance issues that I had to go through, right from getting accepted within this boys club, getting accepted at site, because we used to work very extensively at site. So to go and get the workers to kind of accept you as a girl, trying to explain how a work should be done at site. So these were all immense learning experiences, but in a way it was nice. I mean, it was probably I was very young and energetic that I didn't really stop much to think that is there a discrimination or anything like that. It was all like, okay, you go along. And it continued for about 2-3 years. And then as we all became in our 26 or 27, the kind of age when, as Gautam was saying, where the marriage becomes a very important aspect of your life, then the kind of equations I felt were starting to change. Because, and that was a time when, particularly for the males, it was very important that they set up their own practice or kind of be more eligible in the marriage market to kind of have a more established practice. And in a way, marriage brings in more stability and prosperity to them, and to set up kind of expand your practice. And for a girl, it's exactly the opposite. Imagine you're by 26, 27, you people want you to get married, and then if you want to go back to your parents and say, no, but I need some money to kind of set up my own practice, it just didn't seem to be working out. So I started feeling a little bit of shifty and didn't know. I felt that I need to go along with my journey. And as they say, serendipity, I came across this very beautiful organization called Program for Community Organization. It's a non-profit, non-governmental organization based out of Trivandrum, with a very strong gendering in leadership, actually. So there was some, this was organization where I came to know about Nalini Naik and Ilyama Vijayan and people, John Kurian, so many of them who had already been working to clearly kind of develop the gender dialogue and communicate that to the society at large. And one of my assignments that I took up for this organization was actually setting up, building about 150 houses for in about 8 settlements. It was actually where we had women in the front and women in the center. So my role was actually to kind of act as a facilitator for this whole thing. So we had it was these women from these various villages who formed themselves into collective, and the NGO was very strong in kind of dictating that there was women at decision making at every level, right from the stage where the titles of the land had to be in the name of the women. The women collectives were formed to make the design decisions. Eventually it moved on to so fascinating discussions and fascinating understanding of how design would work when you have the woman in the center. And this was kind of life transforming for me, and it was, and not only for me, the kind of the girls and boys with whom I tried to work on this project. And this also gave me an opportunity, besides the housing, to get involved with a sanitation project, again, which has been discussed earlier. It was at this stage when I actually also realized, working in these kind of communities, that how difficult it is to get access to basic dignity of having your own toilet or a place to kind of feel comfortable. And because we were talking about very crowded fishing villages, we had to actually conceive about a community sanitation project, and the kind of battles that involved to even get a land available for it, and which finally was actually the land which was part of a cemetery of the local church, which was completely kind of used by the men for their open defecation. So we literally had to, I mean, there were days when people would come with knives and sticks to kind of stop our work, and the NGO would be there to kind of protect us, actually. And this was also my exposure to actually developing one of the first, perhaps, decentralized wastewater treatment systems in South India, understand with through nature-based solutions. So it was a journey of understanding and looking at this whole concept. And it was from this practice that I actually understood more about this concept of nurturing in design, which I feel is probably the center of when we call as a feminine approach to architecture. It's this whole idea of nurturing, and it's from people like Nalini and Eliama and all that I realized that this is something that the world really needs. If you want development to be sustainable, if you want spaces to be inclusive, then you need to kind of look at it from a nurturing perspective, actually. So moving on, I kind of was with this NGO for about 3-4 years. And eventually, I think the journey that followed, including probably me and Jay Gopal deciding to formalize a relationship, and then eventually forming Inspiration, which is our firm, which we founded in 1995, I think, has been a conscious effort or conscious kind of journey of nurturing an inclusive practice, which is committed to serve all sections of society, and also to kind of make conscious choices to enable creation of nurturing lifestyles and environs, be it a house, be it a resort or a private sector project, or be it a community hall or a housing project. We kind of explored how we could actually create a practice which could bring in this nurturing, actually. And it's actually very happy for us that over the last, I think, 2 decades, we would have mentored over 100 young men and women, architects, engineers, technicians, artists, and artisans, actually. And more than 50% of them would have been women. We still have a team of about 50, of which I think more than 50 are actually women. And this has also been a learning experience, because when you have more women in your practice, you actually learn to kind of respect and accommodate their multiple roles as caregivers for their families, for their in-laws, for their parents, as young mothers growing up with their children. So eventually it meant to kind of flexibility of timing, flexibility of places of job. And I would say that over the last 2 decades of practice, our biggest investment has been in people. which is something that a chartered accountant is not actually very happy with. But we are quite happy to kind of say that somewhere we have been able to kind of create this kind of a space where people can actually, boys or girls, can actually explore what it would mean by actually practicing or nurture a kind of a built environment. And and it's also quite happy that over these last 2 decades, I think we have also managed that there's never been a single incident of somebody misbehaving with somebody in the site or in our office. So I think somewhere this messages have kind of taken forward and have helped us to feel more comfortable about these spaces actually. So this is our office, in fact. What you see, it's completely built with bamboo with a small rainwater harvesting system. That is our team. You can see the happy faces. This was incidentally for my 50th birthday that we took. And I'll probably share some images of the projects that we do, where we have tried to bring in this concept of nurturing, bringing this concept of looking at a design from an inclusive or a nurturing perspective. I have tried to put it in 2 boxes. The corporate or the private sector works as one section, and the works that we do with non-profits or the non-governmental organization, just for the convenience, because in terms of the works that we do for the private sector or the corporate sector, it's more trying to stretch our limits as designers to include more of the sustainability aspects, more of the sensitivity aspects. Whereas the works with the non-governmental sectors, you have a little more defined agenda where the client already gives you a strong brief, which is kind of very inclusive and sensitive to the people that they are responding to. So I start with some of the private sector works. This is a yoga retreat that we have done in North Karnataka actually. What you see in the forefront is actually a rainwater harvesting lake, which we created digging the soil, and the entire material that has been used has been actually used to build the place. And the roofing is entirely with coconut thatch. So it's really like you completely being sensitive to the local environment, trying to be totally self-sustainable in our water needs, respecting local artisanal skills. And this is, of course, yeah, you can see the material that is used as laterite, respecting the terrain, the craft, actually, the sensitivity and the promotion of local crafts is another thing that we feel is another aspect of nurturing, as you can see. There's a rainwater harvesting lake. Actually, the place can collect almost 6 million liters of water, making it almost totally self-sufficient, not only for the retreat, but also for their entire farming needs. So they kind of grow their own food and use in the property. This is another interesting project where we were given an opportunity to actually design an institute. This is actually the Kerala State Institute of Design. It's a design institute affiliated to National Institute of Design. We could have gone the way of doing a typical 3 or 4 storied block, but we decided that we are actually dealing with designers. So this particular block, which actually is their administrative block and where their director sits and all that, is actually a dismantled old traditional Kerala building, which we have done an adaptive reuse as the spaces for them. Again, the place had a lot of challenge in slopes, and we wanted to kind of create spaces which would get the students free flow of spaces, exteriors and interiors, taking on cue from the actual natural terrains of it, protecting every tree and every natural. So the amphitheater forms actually the core, the heart of the whole design. And you can see the design on the art on the walls was another strong design element. So you can see how we try to kind of create very interactive, kind of intimate yet interactive kind of spaces. This is again their thing, and you can see how spaces were used or are being used by the students and the faculty. Art, as I was saying, this was actually done by a group of students themselves. We gave them a kind of a free hand. So it's a combination of terracotta tiles and wall art, wall graffiti, in combination with, of course, stone masonry and a bit of mud blocks and brickwork. Another place where it's again completely trying to respond to the terrain. Conservation of resources, another thing that which has been very close to our hearts, actually, trying to adaptive reuse of materials. Playful spaces, exteriors and interiors, of course. This is way up in Ladakh, Leh, where we try to capture the entire scenario, and playing with materials. Variety of materials has been something that we have enjoyed. This is actually pebbles from the river in Leh. And moving on to the more the socially inclined projects. This is actually the rehabilitation housing that we did with Psyche after the 2018 floods. What you see is a combination of the earlier buildings which they had, and here we were trying to respond to the marginalized among marginalized, actually. So single women, widows, two women living together, or a woman with a son or a daughter who is actually not well, and I mean, it was really sad, actually. So, and also we kind of reworked on helping them with a school which was upgraded to be a permanent camp. So the work involved trying to respond to using reuse of materials, giving them as much a total product as is possible, including smokeless chulas or well-designed thing, livelihood opportunities, rainwater harvesting, etc., etc. This is another project which we actually did for it was a retirement home for the home nurses from SEVA, which is Self-Employed Women's Association. So most of these home nurses, once they are above their working age, there is nobody to kind of take them. So they put in their small investments, and SEVA actually created the space where almost 25 women could stay in the first phase, and eventually it moves on to almost 50 to 90 women can stay, have their own gardens, a poultry, a small dairy farm, and all that, where they can continue to live in dignity. And so they are very kind of open spaces with a lot of lighting and ventilation, multiple uses, etc., etc. And sometimes also moving to slightly bigger projects. Like this was a very interesting project that we did where we tried to involve the community. This was a rejuvenation of the canal network of Alleppey. Normally, any rejuvenation project would just mean beautification. So eventually it would end up kind of having a bit of masonry somewhere and steps to the water and all that. Whereas here, what we try to do is to look at the root of the problem, which was trying to attend to the pollution and improve the health of the people with community participation. So these were some of the pictures of how we actually went about the work, the canal before it was. And so there was an active people's campaign also from the youth of the town, which was called Tode Ode Ella, which means canals are not drains, actually, which was creating awareness of the need to kind of protect and restore your water bodies. So these were some of the images there. We try to give them proper toilets, bathing facilities, washing areas. So some of these pictures you can see how bad it was when we actually took over in terms of sanitation and spaces, which later was converted into spaces like this. There was an old community toilet which was in a completely dilapidated way. So since we gave them new toilets, it was converted into a small community hall. We also worked with the solid waste management and tried to improve on that. This is the wastewater treatment systems that was designed. The whole participatory process that involved the men and women of the town forming the canal committees and hand-holding them in terms of the operation and maintenance. And this project was actually spearheaded by Dr. Thomas Isaac, the Finance Minister of Kerala, who is actually one of the main proponents of involving people in planning. So what I'm trying to say is that when we talk about inclusiveness, I think it's quite important that we look at planning from the people's perspective, actually, which is often missing. So everywhere where we have had to battle is actually trying to place people in the middle of design, the people in the middle of design in terms of planning. So here, this was also an opportunity where we tried to do a lot of crowd data collection involving the students, which was another interesting work on its own. And I think I'll conclude with a couple of slides on my work with Sakhi and CDD actually. So Sakhi, as Binu was saying, is actually a non-government organization, it's a not-for-profit organization. We've been kind of working in the gender sector for almost 2.5 decades. And basically, Sakhi works on empowering of women elected representatives. So in governance, in terms of capacity building, in terms of adolescent training, and advocacy to make the decision makers more conscious about what real gender empowerment or empowerment means actually, because I think most of you are kind of listening to this also know about Kerala being very active with Kudumbashri and movements like that. But sometimes it's also important to kind of pause and understand that while Kudumbashri mission has succeeded in financial empowerment of women to a certain extent, there is still a lot more work to be done in terms of improving their status in the society, improving their status within their own families beyond just kind of wage earners or cheap wage earners for that matter. So Sakhi actually is on a continuous work both at the grassroots level as well as it is with decision makers to bring in this, taking it to the next stage in terms of understanding and looking at things through the gender lens and advocate for change in all sections of the society for that matter. And my other passion while I've been practicing is also, as I was saying, is in the whole field of water management and conservation. So there is CDD Society, which is actually a consortium of almost 23 organizations, where we have been trying to address the challenge of better management of environment resources at scale and through nature-based solutions for both smaller projects as well as bigger interventions. And so in sum total, I think this journey has been a lot of challenges. I can't say that every day is actually a new discovery. It's kind of a push and pull from everywhere. But I think what makes it interesting is seeing and interacting with people like the panelists that I see today, people like Mono or everyone who kind of I've been interacting. And I think we all need to continue to do this. So I think I'll stop now and then maybe take more when we discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Architect Lata Raman, for sharing your experience as a lady architect, beginning from the little Lata to our she hero. You're learning from the master baker and also about working in programs for community organization, Sakhi, experimenting feminine, inclusive approach of design for a sustainable future, keeping people first. Thank you very much, ma'am. Now over to Architect Monolitha, who is a master brain behind this webinar to moderate all the questions that has been posted to the panelists in the chat box. Mono?
Thank you, Binu. First, I have to congratulate all the speakers for this amazing journey they have taken us through, from the history to the reading of urban spaces to the labyrinths of participation, and then of course Lata's own personal journey as a woman architect. And I do hope that their voices reach a very, very wide audience, because this is a conversation which is way past its time. It's really, really important for us to start talking about this. Now, as we started, the process to this webinar, as Gopakumar was kind of telling about how there was a lot of hesitation, and then this whole thing, it's not the product of a few days. It's quite a long journey of some of us who have been campaigning for a voice within the architectural fraternity and profession, for understanding that there is a gender gap. And as Madhavi very rightly puts it, it really is difficult to break the so-called gender neutrality that architecture wears, and to show perceptively that because of that cloak of gender neutrality, we are not addressing big issues of gender gaps within the profession and in our practice and design. And Lata's examples and some more, Lata's examples are actually brilliant ways of showing what we call the feminized design process. And the feminized design process is not just for the women architects, but it is actually a process of design which is nurturing, which is listening, which is focused on the participants, and which creates a process of collaboration of the user and the designer and everybody. I mean, people don't sit across the table, they actually are all on the same side of the table, and that is how built environment is visualized in this process. And nobody can really tell me that that is not a process that our profession very, very sorely needs. And it is when we start recognizing this importance of feminization of our design processes that we can actually start building this into sympathetic and intuitively nurturing spaces around us, and move away from a lot of the really brutal urbanism that we see, which are very, very users. We have quite a few questions and quite a few points. Like, one of the points that I have want us to go in is because this is a question that I have faced when I have broached this subject, that you keep on talking about gendering of architecture. Why do we need gendering of architecture? Designing for everybody. Why do we specifically need to look at women's needs or queer needs? And I would request Lata or Madhavi and also Gautam to kind of see if, do you have concrete examples that you can help our listeners to understand what is this gendering of architecture in terms of real terms of design? Are there perceptive things that you can think of? Madhavi, would you take that question first?
Uh, yes, I think we are all faced with this particular question. And so far in the mainstream, we believe that when we design for people, it includes everybody, you know, that is the kind of thing that we are taught in our modernist education. But, you know, as some of the speakers said, looking at this from the city to the public toilet, if we do not pay attention, as even Gautam mentioned, to, let's say, the location of the toilet, the design of the toilet, you know, besides, of course, the cost and everything, from the gender viewpoint, it is going to fail. As we know in the Swachh Bharat or whatever the mission is, many toilets are used as storages. So from that to the city level, you know, how the men and women use transport differently, they use the cities differently. And I'm not just talking about women's safety in the city. It's about the women should be able to access all the spaces, and they should derive pleasure, etc. They should, of course, be safe. So there is a whole range of issues which needs this consciousness and sensitivity about, of course, not just women, but the transgenders and the others. But I don't talk about them because I don't know enough about that. But, you know, we need it at all levels in design.
Actually, very simple interventions have been identified when design processes have gone through a gender audit. That, you know, the concepts of privacy changes, the concepts of what different groups of people want from their spaces changes. Again, I talk about queer spaces much because I don't understand it, but women's spaces, I've been working on that for some time. And there are these very strong perceptions of privacy which are mainstreamed. But when a gendering audit was done on Vienna housing, it was realized that women actually prefer their windows, their kitchen windows, to face small playgrounds where their children can be playing, so that they can actually keep an eye on them. And how the route that women take in a day is so different from a man's route as they go about the day. And how design, looking at the man's route, will design for peak hours, which are for office goers. And as Gautam very rightly said, that only 28% of women join the force in India. So there is so many women who are actually left out of the understanding of peak hours. So similarly, Gautam, can you give us some concrete examples of where you see a tangible lack of foresight in understanding of queering of spaces or inclusion of queer spaces?
I can think of a bit more. I think of it a bit more broadly on the gender question itself, right? So, for example, one of the examples that I think is working very well that we were part of. We used to do training for judges in the lower courts in Delhi on how to respond sensitively to questions of sexuality. And we did it for many months. And then actually one of the things that Delhi did in its courts is it designed a new courtroom. And it is an architectural design of a new courtroom on where cases of sexual violence are heard. And it's a very interesting space because what it does is that it spatially separates the entry point for the survivor and the complaint. Takes away the proscenium of the judges. So actually the judges sit at the same level as both the defendant and the plaintiff. And there is a physical visual separation between the survivor and the person who is accused of sexual violence. So that actually because one of the things in which ethnography is of, and this is where I think the methods we use as spatial practitioners or architects to take Rahul's points become really important. Because why did this happen? Because people who wrote narrative ethnographies of the courtroom said one of the things that makes women terrified is very often what would happen is that women would come as survivors of sexual violence, and the person they had accused would come with 5 lawyers, 6 lawyers, the whole family, right? And she would come with one person. So she would come into this courtroom, and we have to stand in this very, power-inducing, monumental physical environment with the judges sitting up. And there were 7 people on the side and 1 person on one side. And what this courtroom does is that it neutralizes that, and she doesn't have to see the person she has accused if she does not want to. And the judge sits on a sofa at her eye level. And it's amazing how much these differences make, and you don't have to even think about these kinds of questions. So what is that saying to that woman who's taken the courage to complain of sexual violence? What it's telling her is that she is welcome in that courtroom, that someone has thought about her in that courtroom, that she can come in and not have to live through the ordeal of violence through coming and looking and interacting with the power of the person she has accused, right? And it's not just that. You go to the Constitutional Court in South Africa, you'll notice that the audience in the Constitutional Court sits higher than the judges. To make a point that in a constitutional bench, the judges serve the people. They serve the Constitution, right? You don't look up to the judges look up to the people. And I think these are small matters. The idea is not that good inclusive design makes people behave better. It's not a determinism argument. It is that an opportunity gets created for people to be able to express and act and be differently. If some signal in a context of inequality is sent that, you can take a little bit of a risk here. When Rahul talked about Shilpa Fatke, what is Shilpa's main argument of work is to say, don't talk to me about women being safe and protected and honorable. Tell me about women who can take the quantum of risk that they choose to take when they want to take it, where they want to take it. Create a built environment that allows me to take risk. Don't create a built environment that makes me choose between safety and freedom. Yeah. And that's exactly what our built environments do.
It connects back to the whole concept.
Absolutely. And so I think it's the same thing about, when universities in India start building hostels, so many people on this call will build hostels. If you take away the basic assumption that hospitals are gender segregated units of living, what is a hostel? right? And what is a hostel? That doesn't mean just have gender neutral things. Can we rethink the spatial idea of a hostel as a space that brings together students in different forms of collectivity, individuals, multiply? How do we learn about how students actually occupy space within hostels? What do we say when we mean that they learn in the corridors more than they learn in the classrooms? I mean, Rahul and I will both admit that our students learn more in the corridors than they learn in our classrooms. And we thank God for it. I mean, that's us great. But our corridors are not designed for learning. I mean, our corridors, you know what I mean? So we keep saying people learn in corridors, yet we make the same corridor with no notion that it's a space for gathering, right? What does a hostel look like when it's a space for gathering? So I would say that the idea is to really to make explicit that there are certain assumptions in the way we design. We aren't even conscious about those assumptions. And those assumptions are not just about materials and functions. It's about our social expectations of proper behavior structured on gender, caste, and sexuality assumptions. If we realize those assumptions are there, we can start unthinking them, rethinking them. We still do it. Everyone uses tactics to get by them, but those tactics it shouldn't be so many fights, right? I think so. That's the kind of thing that I'm trying to think about. And I keep thinking of that courtroom, that one courtroom that takes a place like the Indian courtroom, which is really hardly the most egalitarian space you can imagine in the world, and how it carved out this space in the moment where a person going through a sense of seeking justice for sexual violence felt recognized and felt welcome, right? And had that experience. That's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about. It's that kind of perspective.
Yeah. When we are talking, I mean, these are these inputs that needs to be heard and responded to by the design community as a whole. What Rahul was talking about learning to listen. I wanted to go to Rahul. Rahul, could you actually give us some very particular examples of participation where, as you implemented processes of inclusion of every voice, the design output or the imagination of the that you were working with started changing?
I mean, this is something which is almost intrinsic part of our practice. So for example, I'm not an architect, but my team includes architects, and they are doing a lot of work in what we call homegrown neighborhoods. We have an argument about calling certain kinds of enclaves, which we often dismiss as slums, as places of high agency. So high agency means there are already very active people over there who have a lot to say, but their language of design, their language of architecture is different. So there is, for example, a graphic or a mediated drawing is not the starting point. It's like in many craftsmanship, it's an oral tradition. Contractors learn from previous experience while they were at work, and then they start shaping the design of their building. So we have a project called Design Comes As We Build. The title itself, represents a certain kind of process in which the contractor and the client, who's often the person who's commissioned the contractor, they work together. And our role was to essentially listen to both of them and then mediate a conversation. And this conversation was based on fundamental principles of not imposing the idea that the building should be like this, but actually allowing the design to emerge from that process. So this is something which is really very integral to a lot of what we do. We are doing a project now in a place called Sangam Gali in Dharavi, which is also about a process where all the residents are giving their inputs all the time. The 2 or 3 of them are very strong community leaders. They are all women, and they are leading a lot of these conversations in terms of the design of a home or a shop, because there's a lot of active presence of women in Dharavi because of the way in which the neighborhood is shaped. There is a lot of domesticity even in the public space, and it is and of course because of classical division of labor in a very reductive way, where women are often relatively more confined to workspaces. This also becomes an opportunity in certain neighborhoods to spill over and become part of community discussions. So this is something which in a lot of our practice, my architect colleagues tell me this is endemic to what we do. And so there are all kinds of projects which emerge. buildings, homes, community halls, which are not things which we will measure in aesthetic terms alone, in terms of the classical learning of architecture, but in terms of how many voices are embedded in that building, how many people have actually participated, and how many of them. So it's a different scale, and we have to, play around with that. It's not something which is where we
because
can
a
be
simple
definitive.
a simple thing like distance between certain amenities actually become a tool for exclusion for certain groups of people, and
Absolutely, absolutely.
the point A to point B becomes a point of exclusion, like what Gautam was talking about in terms of the armor, and what Lata was talking about the resistance that she breezed through because of the energy at younger years. What we keep on thinking of is this thing only, that every morning you wake up, you and you kind of negotiate as women or as queer people, you kind of negotiate that, okay, today this is how strong I am, and these are the more important battles that I'm going today. And your life becomes a sum of those days, and how we can actually address some of these like, the thing about women on queer people going into public spaces is the same kind of resistance we face as women when we move into power structures, when we move into partnership offices, when we move into positions of leadership within the fraternity, and the kind of there is no other way but sexist, to call them out as sexist comments and sexist attitudes, and which are passed off as jokes that we face at an everyday level. And while some of us probably take it on our stride, Lata, me, Binu, and move on and we fight our battles, but we know so many women who don't have the stomach, that kind of a fight. Madhavi, I go back to you on this. As a historian, you have measured the women who you have documented that privileged backing, which at least enabled them to escape one hurdle, right? But when we talk about today's students, today the architectural girls who are entering architecture college or exiting architecture college, they don't really come from that same privileged class. They all come from the same middle or middle class background people enter, and we see these women fall out along the way. What do you think, what can we change in our college education and post college years to retain more women in the profession and make it a little friendlier? Because it's not very nice for us to say, oh, if you are enough, you will. Good enough for a woman is very different from good enough for men.
Yeah, so Monolitha, when I was much younger and I talked about some of these issues, everybody told me, oh, these are social issues. Why are you talking about it in a professional forum? And it used to shut me up because I could not reply. But I'm much older and more experienced, and I know, yes, there are things that you can do at the social level, at the family level. But, as you say, what can we do in education? First of all, in education, but even before education, I think we should have some counseling cells, because unfortunately in India, a lot of the girls are admitted into professional courses because it is good for marriage. Because in the late 20th and 21st century, men want women with professional or degrees, not just with a BA or a BCom, which used to be there in the late 60s and 70s. So that is one, oh, my daughter is very good in painting, she should go into architecture. But they have no idea what the reality, how much. Years ago, I did a survey of first year students. And one of the last questions was, what do you think you will be doing in 10 years' time? And most of them thought they will be sitting in an air-conditioned office designing. And so there is a whole wrong notion about what the professional practice is. So that's one thing. But I think so we should have a counseling cell where we give some good information about the reality of the practice. In education, I have done a whole essay. There are many things we can do, but let's say 4 or 5 things we can try to get more and more women lecturers, jurors, etc. So there is more visibility. We give more importance to courses in business, give more training on site, because that is one thing I personally found. I did not have enough confidence on site. And then when you go to site, and when all the, the laborers and the contractors look at you with a lot of suspicion, you already don't have enough confidence. And then slowly you just, okay, the other thing that happens is the young girls who drop out are not ready to accept that I did something wrong.
Let's go on.
देखा तो नहीं.
Don't worry about it.
No, we can hear you, Madhavi.
You can? Okay.
We can see you.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, I've got the last slide by mistake. I don't know how I did it. So the
We
girls
can hear you.
very, very often think that they don't accept the fact that it is very hard to practice, or it is very hard to bring up children and practice or go to work. So very often they drop out and they tell themselves that it was a choice I made, and that sort of is a myth, which is not really true. So there are things we can do in education, there are things we can do in practice. For example, I think this kind of sensitivity has to become mainstream. All the offices have to know that, first of all, it is good to be inclusive. Women bring a lot of different kind of strengths to the practice. They don't have to be marginalized. So, give them a lot of responsibility, involve them with clients, give them larger projects to handle, send them to site, give them flexibility in terms of maternity leaves, etc., etc. So there is a lot can be done, Monalitha.
Lata, I would like you to also, because you have mentored women through your practice, and if you can share some ideas of how women, Rahul too, Rahul has a very good team of women, and how you can how your practice is helped by the female voices, and why it is important for us to actually take that what we consider an extra effort, but it is not actually an extra effort because of what every woman employee brings to the table. I can tell you, I've always felt that women employees have given me much harder work and much more and sense of responsibility, and it breaks my heart every time I lose any of my special kids to the marriage. I mean, literally it breaks my heart. So both Rahul and Lata, if you can take this. Lata first and then Rahul probably.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said. And I also feel like, as Madhvi was saying, I think we need to kind of have the sensitizing from high school through professional college, because I don't think there is in any of the studies that we do a conscious narrative on gender inclusiveness and all that. And so therefore, I think you need to sensitize not just the women to become stronger and be more assertive, but also the men, the boys need to be kind of sensitized on how to be more accommodating and how to actually, I mean, it's macho to be kind of it's not chivalry that you're expecting, but it's kind of an inclusive kind of standing side by side that you're expecting. So I think education is definitely, continuous and also probably sensitizing the fraternity. Like probably this is the first webinar of our kind after so much of discussions that we have had. But I hope that this will be a continuing dialogue, and it's going to trigger off much more such sessions. And as I said in my presentation also, I think definitely having women in a team brings in so much more of value to the whole design process. One is that, and then as you rightly said, they are definitely much more hardworking. There is much more loyalty in that sense, who want to continue. And I think that if you are giving them a kind of a nurturing environment, they really blossom also. So it's just that you need to kind of give them that
little bit of mentoring, little
exactly,
support,
exactly,
understanding
yeah.
of even their family situation.
Yes.
Because they don't come to work every day with the same, somebody cheering them from back. Most of the time, if they're putting in 1 hour extra after office hours, their parents are calling up, why are you not at home yet?
Right.
And all that. So they are these things at an everyday level when they're working, and then they produce good work, equal work, better work than the men. And it's just floors.
Yeah, that's true.
Every
And
time.
we have had
Rahul, you would.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I think Rahul should continue. Right.
Okay, thank you, Lata. No, I just would like to, of course, compliment whatever both of you all have said. I agree with it very strongly. It's just that we are a very small team, and Matthias and me now are already sort of an older generation. We are hoping for our younger team members to take over and take charge. And Samita and Karina and my team very well, and they are more than capable. And we are very, very hopeful that that when we expand, for us it should be spontaneous. We have had an experience of all kinds of people, men, women. There's a huge variety, of course, between in experiences, and I'm sure there have been people who have not been happy, people who have been happy. So that variety is there, and we are very small as a group. But on the whole, and through a larger sociological observation, I definitely believe that a lot of women in India, particularly in a conservative context, they value the space of work and occupation as being part of an identity, largely because in many contexts they're denied it. So there is a lot of investment which one sees very strongly. And this is something which one should generally say about the workforce in India. I've seen that when women, take charge of projects of all kinds, it does much better. And whatever the reason may be, the fact is that it is an empirical truth which nobody can deny. We're talking about women panchayat leaders, we're talking about women political leaders. So this is true in many cases.
Yeah. Gautam, I would just like to come back to you on the point of, the comfortable sexual violence survivor that you talked about in terms of the court. And I just wanted to scope it out also to the point that public spaces in India do not imagine women to be in the public. And of course, queer people and trans people are not even in the scope of imagination as we move into designing, planning of spaces. And as a result, our urban spaces actually generate a lot of sexual violence. It generates which nurture sexual violence. And I would like you to talk a little bit about that, because even public toilets, we always talk about public toilets and the discussion ends with the number of toilets women have, or the number of toilets, or the absence of toilets for trans people, and their the contradiction about which toilet to go to. But we don't really understand also that, say for example, a toilet or a dark park or parking spaces, parking lots, of violence and sexual violence, especially for the people who are made vulnerable by urban spaces.
I think that this is the kind of continuum that we're talking about, right? In a sense, our public spaces reflect our shared societal values and our prejudices. So they're actually a spatialization of the current hierarchies and inequalities in our society. The first people that our public spaces devalue are workers of all genders, of all genders, of all sexualities, and not of all castes, because of course most people who work in public are not of all castes. They're of very particular places in a caste-defined social polity, and we don't recognize those spaces as caste spaces, right? We call them public spaces, but they're not. I'm taking the example of caste in this case, but it is the same way you can read it through in terms of gender and sexuality. And again, I'm insisting on that joint reading. So if you take a space that does not care about or ask the question of where do, 84% of India's urban workers are informal workers, right? Yet when we had this COVID moment and when we had a lockdown, what was our claim? stay at home and work at home. Honestly, as spatial practitioners, we literally, as a professional community, should have been up in arms against this utterly ludicrous direction. To tell, I mean, 63% of urban Indians live in, who have more than 3 members in their family, live in less than 2 rooms. We know this. We don't come in a built form where private homes around households are the dominant nature of the way people live. Most people do not work at home, they work in public space. Right? And so in many places, but that same public space before COVID, we have never asked the question of where does a street vendor go to the bathroom? Where does a street vendor put her child when she works? You know, one of the projects that we've been involved in is to say, how do domestic workers manage to breastfeed their children without maternity leave? I mean, we brought up the question of maternity in professional practice, but remember, 4 of every 5 Indian workers have no access to formal labor protections. And we are the minority in these protections. So actually, my point about thinking about those public infrastructures is let's look at the reality of where most people who inhabit and use those spaces, actually, where do they live? What kind of lives do they live and where do they work? And then ask, what should this space look like? So what I'm struck by, for example, for women's work, one of the largest numbers of home-based workers in the world are in South Asia, right? Which means for many working women, the home is a space of work. It's a space where they're doing piece rate work, they're doing tailoring work, they're rolling BDs, they're making agarbattis. There's tons of home-based work that's going on, right? It's a crucial part of the family, completely invisibilized. As invisibilized as their unpaid care work. Now, if we start thinking of working class homes as spaces of work, the stay at home or stay at office, what is the design we should be teaching our architects in our architectural classrooms when we tell them to design a residence? I've never been to, you know, when I was in planning in university, and I used to be on arch juries, and all the architects, the students used to hate me because I never asked a thing about the model. I didn't care. I used to ask them what's behind the site. What's the story of the person who lives on the site? And they would literally be like, you know, when someone gives you a look that you're asking out of syllabus question, they would give me the out of syllabus question look. And it's one of the things we're trying to think through here is most Indians think about working out of home, yet our notion of home in architecture is residence and shelter. It just literally doesn't fit our urban forms. Yeah. The sense, I don't think we can get to questions of inclusion if we are still designing built form as if we are architects that work in Spain. And we don't work in Spain, we work in India. And so I think that for me, a lot of my sense of architectural form in this thing is when we think about public spaces, which is the public you're designing for? And then all the layers will unravel. First is literally a working Indian public, then a working Indian public of multiple identities. And then once we start unraveling who our public actually is, then I think this is a big question that we have to then think about. What those spaces will immediately start looking different because you'll center the people and you'll center what they need at this point. And then I think we'll build in and think. And the architects are not the only people who have to take this on. The planners and the engineers are equivalently folks where we need to return the people and their centricity into our built form. I have one last thing I want to say about the previous discussion on is an experiment that we are slowly trying to get to, which I feel very strongly about in terms of gender diversity and inclusive workspaces, which is that we have got to start mandating equivalent paternity and maternity leave. I do not understand the business of 3 to 6 months maternity and 12 days paternity. So either there are parents or there are mothers. And the minute you don't have an equivalent paternity leave for men, you're always going to have a career progression break where men will never, every HR is going to turn around and say, I need to have
to come back.
Without mandated equivalent caregiver leave. So where I work, we don't have maternity and paternity. We have primary and secondary caregiver leave. And the whole point about it is you've got it. They're not equivalent yet. They're not mandatory. They should be. We're still a work in progress. But at least we've let go of this idea of maternity. If you don't have paternity leave, you shouldn't have maternity leave. Either have both and make them equal. Because this part I don't understand. And I've seen it too often happen, even in places where people are staying out. Because once you have that exit, that re-entry is always compromised. It's just a thought. It's something that's an old pet peeve of mine. So I couldn't resist putting it there.
Yeah, architectural firms have neither maternity nor paternity.
I mean, it's so good. You can put them
very gender equal that way.
You can put them both together. You know, it's like one generation skipped the landline phone and went straight to cell phones. You all can skip that older form and just start with them both together. It's nice.
And yeah, exactly. There is a question about the behavioral change with respect to build space, saying it cannot be about causality of inclusive spaces, manifesting towards inclusive behavior all the time. We would like to know some thoughts on this as to how must one tackle this complex mesh about behavior aspect, design aspect, and policy aspect. I mean, who would like to respond to this? Was the question clear?
No.
Yeah, so basically what the question that is being talked about is that it is not just about spatial infrastructure, it is the design aspect, it is also the behavior aspect and the policy and social infrastructure, I mean, how does this complex mesh come together? Does anybody have a vision about that? I think that's more the question. Gautam, as an activist, would you like to take? Yeah, would you like to take a punt at that as an activist, Gautam?
Oh, you're asking me? Sure. I mean, I think. I would take Rahul's argument here.
Rahul, do you want to respond to that?
After Gautam, yeah.
I mean, I'll be very brief. I would say I don't think any of us take a deterministic argument. I think the question is, if you take Rahul's point about participation quite centrally, then the question I think is that the more participatory that approach is, the more that space can hold multiple contestations. That's the best we can hope for. To me, a democratic, inclusive space is one where many people have a stake in it, even if they're fighting with each other in that stake. You know, if there's no one settled control. So I think that I would go with Rahul's point here. I think it's not about the design of it. It's about the process of it as much as possible. And if the design can invite that participation, that's the best we can do.
Yeah. Rahul, do you want to
That's it.
respond to this? That how, as a sociologist, how do you see this mesh coming together between human behavior and response, or design development, or design process? If you don't think of design as a response, but something which kind of happens together.
Yeah, I think Gautam summarized it very well just now. And just to elaborate that a little more, there is also this whole idea of the expert or the professional, which is also, a very special way in which we look at occupation and work and identity. And the burden of being a professional and the burden of being the expert, because, professionals also have an internal guild of people who are all the time challenging, whatever we imagine. Suppose an architect is very responsive to participatory inputs. There may be an entire question being raised by the professional guild which says, sorry, that's not architecture at all. That's not, that is not design, which is valid. So if you actually start responding to the question in terms of enmeshing behavior and policy and design, and make it integral to a process which is professionally recognized and validated, then we'll get somewhere. But right now there are too many fault lines. It's not going to be so easy.
I want to add to what Rahul has been saying. In the 60s, there was this whole emphasis on users' participation in design. And I think it was really a great thing. And that is something that needs to come back in today's. Architecture has moved so much to the design of the surfaces. It's gone very far from the participatory process. And I would like to forget about, any other issues, but what he is practicing is excellent, I think.
Closing remarks. I would invite all the speakers, Madhavi, Gautam, Rahul, and Lata, in terms of so as you said, this is a kind of a start, a public discussion, probably for the first time, on topics which were till now behind closed doors. And we are trying to now bring into mainstream by making people understand that everybody has gender, and the need for gender inclusion and gender balance is a problem which everybody is affected with if we don't somehow facilitate that. So that process of facilitation, in your closing remarks, if you would like to address as to what you think are certain immediate or not so immediate steps you feel that we as the profession, we as the institute, and we as people can do. Madhavi, would you take it first? We'll go with the order of the speakers.
Okay, I really don't, I have said a few things in my slides and I don't, but for me, there was so much of learning from the three speakers and from our discussion at the end that you have very nicely moderated, Monolitha. So for me, it's been an extremely valuable, time that I have spent here. I just hope that maybe the essence of our discussion, I have a little aversion to webinars, to say the least. So if somebody, Binu or somebody was taking notes, or, if we can have some sort of summary of what we have discussed here, that would be very valuable for me, in words or something, very briefly. But and congratulations again to you, Monolitha, and the Kerala chapter. I say the Kerala does it the best in India. So thank you again for inviting me.
Gautam?
Again, just my thanks as well. I really, really enjoyed listening to folks. And I would only say that I think my plea to architects is, as Rahul was saying, there are many fault lines. I don't think we can't just get up and practice anew tomorrow. None of us have that kind of luxury and privilege. But I think that once we see our practice as being rooted in a certain set of structures, social structures, there are many moves you can make that feel small that are very large. It may be a commission project with a client, and it's a small shift there. And then sometimes opportunities come where very large shifts become possible. But I think unless we begin to consciously look for those opportunities to think differently and practice differently, we don't notice when they're in front of us. So sometimes I think in my experience, especially around sexuality, there isn't a need to immediately do something. It's the only thing need to immediately do is to begin to work on our own openness and to work on our own ways of seeing the world, to locate ourselves on it. And that's not very comfortable. I mean, I think for me, for example, in sexuality, I've had to we've done so much work in getting other people to see us. But in terms of my other identities, I've had to do a lot of unlearning of my own privilege as an English-speaking upper caste Hindu elite man. I've had a lot of unthinking and unlearning of my own privileges, while also understanding what it means to be a gay man in this society. And I think a lot of the work, actually, very often when we have discussions on this, our immediate sense is what to do. And my only plea is, for a while, I would say, let's just sit with it with ourselves. Think about our ways of seeing. Think about our ways of knowing the world. And the minute we begin to see and listen a bit more carefully, we will have our own set of ideas on how to change our own practices from where we are, how to become and move towards that. And I think that we have to feel that it's worth doing. And I think from the perspective of everyone in the webinar, I would say it would be really, what would be important for you to hear from at least from behalf of the queer community, is that how much it makes a difference to be in an environment that you believe could be affirming and welcoming of you. I just want to leave you with that, to never underestimate how much that sensitivity makes a difference to people who come into the spaces that you design. We notice. It's not as small. These are very, very big things. So it's worth taking that effort on learning and growing ourselves.
Actually, just before the webinar started, when just Binu and I were in the Zoom, and we were discussing about our friends who all came out with sexual diversity after college. And over a period of time, I never thought of it during college, but as one by one, so many lesbian and gay and queer friends came out post college. And I come from SPA, where we always had that hat of being very liberal and very free and everything. And somehow that atmosphere didn't empower them to come out to us, who we thought we were their closest friends. And somehow, somewhere, we were probably exhibiting a nervous and not come out. So I think there is a certain level of social inclusion which is lacking even within our architectural colleges, which we need to understand and talk about. Rahul, going to you for way forwards from here.
I heard both you and Gautam said very important things, Madhvi and Lata also, and today I'm really happy to be part of this discussion. And my emphasis has always been that we need to be more adventurous institutionally. We need to be more adventurous professionally. We need to have more young women and a huge variety of people, how they identify themselves in doing things confidently, in doing things in a manner which are not burdened by standard expectations of doing things. So, for example, if an architect comes out, listen, I'm going to do architecture the way I want to. I have learned, but I have also want to unlearn. And if 3 or 4 of me, we are women, we are men, we are whatever, but we want to come together and we want to do things differently, ask new questions. I feel that is the most important thing to do. And our responsibility also as people of a more established generation is the fact that we need to make it more lighter, more freer for the next generation. And let us not fetter them by any kind of, even with concepts, such high, sort of putting such high benchmarks that they feel they have to live up. The fact is that if they can come out and do things in a free way, that's what is most important. What in every part, in every possible way, families as institutions, schools as institutions, these are all institutions, and institutions by definition often tend to be heavy. So if we can create a space of breathing and freedom for next generation, and however they want to practice, allow the professional and technical the earlier generation to make it freer for the next. That itself will open so many things for everybody. That would be my, my observations, which I would like to share.
Very, very interesting and important, because architectural firms also have very intrinsic power structures embedded in them with the top architect, and even our perceptions of the profession always is with this, who are the star architects and who are the successful architects. And whereas there are probably hundreds and thousands of ways architects are in architecture and in allied fields probably making a lot of impact, which does not get recognized in the profession. So that's also a power structure which probably needs to be broken. Lata, you and I are buddies, we have a way forward. So
I know. So I'm so happy that we made this happen today, Mono. And I know that this is going to be a continuing journey for us. Let's try and more strongly. But my takeaways, of course, it was a brilliant session. I learned so much from the other speakers too. What I feel is that, we are going through so many crises now. The COVID has taught us, the floods and so many things are teaching us the kind of link between human health and the environment and the sustainability of the built environment, the natural environment and all that. So I think more and more our profession needs to recognize this sensitivity. We need to kind of empower our younger generation, the coming up architects, boys and girls, to kind of be conscious about this and somewhere mentor them to take the right decisions, because otherwise sooner or later we're going to have much bigger crisis actually. And to make that happen, we need to look at keeping the people in the center of any design, bringing in the inclusiveness, hearing all voices. I think this is going to be a
who has silently made all this possible technically, to please convey his our vote of thanks for all of us. He will be conveying the formal vote of thanks.
Yeah, good evening all. So actually a big, I would say it's a revolutionary webinar. It's when everybody hear about a webinar organized by architects, there was a normal like this is going to be there for the discussion. So it was entirely a different thing altogether. And thank you one and all, especially the speaker, all speakers who found time to like almost, it was almost like 2.5 hours now. So thank you one and all, and all the attendees who are there. I think many from outside Kerala also joined for this, and the whole team of office bearers who really like stood together to organize this, and our moderator architect Monolitha, who did a brilliant job. Thank you one and all.